The first thing you need to understand is that I have been watching birds for 11 years. And in 11 years, I have never once been wrong about a migration date. Not by a week, not by 3 days, not by a single morning. People who don't do this assume it's a casual hobby, something you do on weekends with binoculars around your neck and a thermos of coffee, ticking boxes in a laminated field guide. And yes, it looks like that from the outside. But what it actually is, what it becomes after a decade, is pattern recognition so deep it operates below conscious thought. You stop seeing individual birds. You start seeing calendars. You start seeing weather systems, temperature gradients, pressure fronts. You start seeing the invisible architecture of the world expressed through feathers and flight paths. So when the cedar waxwings arrived on October 11th, I didn't need to check my records to know something was wrong. I checked anyway. That's the discipline. October 14th was the earliest documented arrival date for this species at this latitude in the last 11 years of my personal records. The Regional Audubon Society database backed me to October 15th as the regional early arrival threshold. 3 days early doesn't sound like much until you understand that birds don't have margin. They don't miscalculate. They don't rush. The environmental triggers that govern migration, photoperiod, temperature, barometric pressure, magnetic field sensitivity, are not imprecise instruments. A 3-day early arrival isn't a rounding error. It's a distress signal. But that wasn't the part that stopped me cold on the trail behind the water treatment facility at 6:47 in the morning. The part that stopped me was the behavior. Cedar waxwings travel in loose, social flocks. They are gregarious, vocal, and when they arrive, they descend on berry-bearing trees and shrubs with a controlled chaos of a system working exactly as designed. You can watch a flock of cedar waxwings for 40 minutes and come away feeling that the world is in order. They're that precise, that reliable. These birds were not feeding. A flock of what I estimated at 60 to 80 individuals had settled in the hawthorn stand along the eastern fence line, and they were sitting. Still, oriented all in the same direction, facing northwest, which was not the direction of food, not the direction of water, not the direction of anything except the Harwick County Agricultural Corridor 12 miles out. They weren't making contact calls. They weren't jostling for perch position. They were performing a behavior I had no name for because I had never seen it. I stood there for 19 minutes. I have the timestamps in my field notes. I took photographs. I recorded audio. I wrote 3 paragraphs of observation notes in the small weatherproof notebook I carry in my left jacket pocket, the one my sister Renata gave me 4 birthdays ago with for the important things written on the inside cover in her handwriting. Then I walked back to my car, drove home, and posted my observations to the North Central Migration Forum under the title, Anomalous Early Arrival plus Atypical Flock Stasis Behavior. Anyone else seeing this? I remember thinking it was probably nothing. I remember knowing it wasn't. My name is Dara Osei. And before all of this, I taught middle school science at Vellum Creek Elementary Middle School, which is a misleading name because it serves grades 4 through 8 and is located neither near a creek nor near anything called Vellum. I mention the teaching because it matters later. The way I think, the way I explain things, the way I reach for analogies when the real language isn't available to me, all of that comes from standing in front of 26 11-year-olds and trying to make the invisible world visible enough to be interesting. I live alone. I have lived alone since my divorce from Marcus 4 years ago, which was not acrimonious so much as it was quietly inevitable in the way that some things are. We still talked. We talked that week, actually, which is the kind of detail that lands differently now. My neighbor across the street is a retired postal worker named Clifton Boo, who is 71 years old, drinks his coffee black, and who had, at that point, tolerated 3 years of me appearing at his front door with my phone held out, saying, "Look at this about a bird." He never once told me he wasn't interested. He just looked where I pointed with the patient attention of someone who has decided that the world is large and the people in it deserve courtesy. I don't know what Clifton thought about birds before I moved in. I know that by October of that year, he could identify a brown creeper by silhouette. The forum post got 4 responses by noon. The first was from a user called Birds of the Lake District, who said that waxwing behavior could be disrupted by electromagnetic interference from cell towers, which is a persistent myth in amateur birding communities and is not supported by any peer-reviewed literature. I said so politely. The second was from Phoebe. Actually, her real name was Greta. I knew her from regional meetups. Who said she'd seen a similar stasis behavior in starlings 2 years prior in the Netherlands, and offered a link to a Dutch ornithology paper I spent 40 minutes trying to read through a translation tool. The paper described a coordinated predator avoidance response in which entire flocks suspended normal behavior in the presence of an invisible or diffuse threat that had not yet resolved into a locatable source. The birds, in other words, could sense something wrong, but couldn't identify its direction. So they stopped moving entirely to avoid moving toward it. The third response asked me what lens I used. The fourth response said, "Cool post." I forwarded the Dutch paper to the county health department's environmental monitoring email address, which I had used once before to report a fish kill in Barrett Pond that turned out to be a routine algae bloom. I wrote a message explaining the early arrival, the stasis behavior, the paper, and my general sense that something in the agricultural corridor might be worth checking. I was careful with my language. I said I'm not a scientist, and I may be misreading this and worth flagging to someone more qualified. I wrote those qualifiers because I knew what happened when lay people made dramatic claims without credentials. I was trying to be credible by being humble. I did not hear back that day. I made dinner. I graded a set of lab reports on water cycle diagrams. I called Renata and talked for 40 minutes about her daughter's soccer tournament. I did not sleep well. At 2:14 in the morning, I got up and stood at my bedroom window and looked at the hawthorn stand visible at the far edge of the streetlight's reach. And even from that distance, even in the dark, I could tell the birds were still there, still facing northwest, still not moving. The next morning was October 12th, which is now a date that belongs to a different category of human experience entirely. At the time, it was a Wednesday, which meant I had a second period class covering ecosystems interdependence. And I had spent Sunday preparing a lesson built around keystone species. The idea that the removal of a single organism can cascade through an entire system in ways that are disproportionate to that organism's apparent size or importance. I stood in front of my class and taught that lesson, and the entire time I was thinking about the waxwings. Mireille Fontaine was in my second period class. Mireille was 13 and had recently discovered that she was exceptionally good at asking questions that made adults uncomfortable, which meant she was either going to be a journalist or a defense attorney, and I was rooting for journalist. She raised her hand 20 minutes into the lesson and asked, "What happens when the warning signal exists, but no one in the ecosystem is built to read it?" I stopped. I said, "Say more." She shrugged with the particular eloquence of a 13-year-old and said, "Like, the birds all fly away before an earthquake because they feel the magnetic thing or whatever. But humans can't feel the magnetic thing. So the signal exists, but we're just not receiving it." "What happens then?" "What happens then," I said, "is that the event occurs without warning. For us, not for everything." She nodded like I had confirmed something she already suspected. I went home that afternoon and drove to the water treatment facility trail, and the hawthorns were empty. Every single bird gone. A departure that abrupt and total. From 80 individuals to 0 between my 6:15 a.m. drive-by check and my 3:40 p.m. arrival was itself anomalous. Waxwings don't bolt. They drift. They relocate incrementally as food sources deplete. I stood in front of the empty Hawthorne stand and felt the particular cold of a confirmation that gives you nothing useful. They had been here. They had registered something. And then they had left. Which meant whatever they were registering had either resolved or escalated beyond the threshold where proximity was survivable. I updated my forum post. I added the departure data. Greta responded within 20 minutes and said, "Dara, this is giving me a strange feeling. Have you contacted anyone official?" I told her about the county health email. She said, "Try the state environmental monitoring line and the university extension office. They have a wildlife behavior consultation line." I tried both. The state monitoring line put me on hold for 11 minutes and then transferred me to a voicemail box for a department I didn't recognize. I left a message. The university extension office was staffed by a pleasant graduate student named, according to his voicemail, Derek, who was not available but would return calls within 2 business days. That night, I called Marcus, not because I thought he could do anything. He was an accountant in Bridgeport. But I had been sitting with this feeling for 36 hours, and I needed to say it out loud to someone who knew me well enough to tell me if I was losing my grip on reality. I explained the whole thing, the arrival date, the stasis behavior, the paper, the departure. He listened without interrupting, which had always been one of the better things about Marcus. Then he said, "Dara, birds do weird things, right? That's kind of your whole thing. They're always doing something you've never seen before." I said, "No, that's the opposite of my whole thing. My whole thing is that they are almost never doing something I've never seen before. And when they are, it means something." He said he understood, and that he'd check in with me tomorrow, and that I should try to sleep. I did not sleep. On the morning of October 13th, 2 days before the first confirmed case appeared on any news broadcast, though I didn't know that timeline yet, I drove 45 minutes to the Harrick County Agricultural Corridor. I want to be precise about why I did this, because it would be easy to frame it as heroic instinct. It wasn't. It was closer to the way you keep pressing a bruise. The birds had been facing northwest. Northwest was the corridor. I needed to see if there was anything to see, not because I had a plan, but because the alternative was going to school and standing in front of a class and pretending I wasn't carrying a warning I couldn't deliver. The corridor is a 12-mile stretch of industrial-scale farming operations, grain storage, livestock facilities, a rendering plant on the south end, 2 large-scale poultry operations whose ventilation stacks are visible from the highway. It is not beautiful. It smells like scale, like the part of food production that exists so you don't have to think about food production. I pulled off the highway at the overlook above the Marchetti grain facility and got out of the car with my binoculars. The facility was quiet, not closed quiet. There were vehicles in the lot, lights on in the admin building, but operationally quiet in a way that didn't match the time of day. At 8:20 in the morning, grain facilities are moving. Conveyors running, trucks staged at loading bays, shift workers visible at multiple points. What I saw was a lot with cars, but no movement between them. I watched for 12 minutes. One person came out of the building, walked to a truck, sat in the truck cab, and did not drive away. I didn't know what I was looking at. I still don't know, even now, exactly what was happening at that facility on the morning of October 13th. What I know is what my body registered before my brain had language for it, which was the same thing the waxwings had registered 3 days earlier. Something diffuse and unlocatable and wrong. I got back in my car and drove to the county seat and walked into the offices of the Harwick Courier, which was a local paper with a circulation of about 8,000 and a staff of, at that point, 3 full-time journalists. I asked to speak to whoever covered environmental and agricultural stories. I was directed to a reporter named Cass Pruitt, who was 26 years old, had graduated from a journalism program in Ohio, and was the kind of person who took notes by hand, even when typing would be faster, which I took as a good sign. I sat across from her desk and told her everything. The arrival date, the stasis behavior, the Dutch paper, the departure, the drive to the corridor, the facility that was quiet in the wrong way. I showed her my field notes. I showed her the photographs. I was not emotional. I had decided on the drive over that emotion was the fastest way to lose her. So I presented everything the way I presented evidence to my students, sequentially with sourcing, with explicit acknowledgement of what I knew versus what I was inferring. Cass Pruitt listened to all of it. She took notes, real notes, not courtesy notes. She asked clarifying questions. She asked me to spell Marchetti. She asked how to access the regional Audubon database. Then she said, "I can't run a story based on bird behavior and a feeling you got in a parking lot." I said, "I know. I'm not asking you to run a story. I'm asking you to make a phone call to the facility and to the county health office and see if anything unusual has been reported." She said she would look into it. I gave her my number. I went back to my car. I sat in the parking lot of the Harwick Courier for a while, looking at the dashboard. The feeling I had in that moment was not the clean relief of having handed something off. It was the specific dread of knowing you have done everything available to you, and that it was not enough, and that there was no additional action that would make it enough. The gap between what I knew and what anyone with authority would act on was not something I could bridge with more evidence. It was structural. I was a middle school science teacher with binoculars. That was the entire problem. I went to school the next morning, October 13th. Still, I had driven back late. And I taught my classes, and I checked my phone between every period, and no one called. Not the county health department, not the state monitoring line, not Derek from the university extension office, not Cass Pruitt. Greta messaged me on the forum at 11 a.m. "Has anyone responded?" I wrote back, "No." She sent 3 messages in quick succession. The first said that she had looked up the Marchetti facility and found a routine USDA inspection report from 8 months prior. Nothing flagged. The second said she had tried to find any news about the corridor and found nothing. The third said, "Dara, I believe you. I just don't know what else we can do from here." I appreciated the honesty. What I didn't have yet was a way to explain that the believing wasn't the part I needed. At lunch, I sat in my classroom and wrote a longer post on the forum, the most detailed account I'd produced yet, with all of my field notes transcribed, the photos embedded, links to the Dutch paper, a brief explanation of what I'd seen at the Marchetti facility. I titled it, "Requesting Help, Attempting to Reach the Right People, Not Getting Through." The post accumulated 17 responses over the next 4 hours. Most of them were kind. Several were useless in the constructive way. Suggestions to contact agencies I'd already tried. Names of researchers who studied migration anomalies at universities in other states. One person offered to amplify the post on social media, which I said yes to, not because I thought it would lead anywhere, but because doing nothing felt like a different kind of damage. The unkind ones were specific in their unkindness, which I want to acknowledge because I think it matters. They weren't random cruelty. They were the particular flavor of dismissal that comes from someone who has decided that the category of person you are, amateur, unlicensed, emotional, disqualifies the content of what you're saying. One said, "This is what happens when birders watch too many disaster movies." Another said my Dutch paper was from 2009 and therefore outdated. Another said that birds arriving early in autumn was, and I'm quoting directly, literally just called climate change. And it's been happening for years, so maybe don't catastrophize. I closed the forum tab. I called Clifton that evening because I needed to be near someone who would just listen. He came over. This is the thing about Clifton. He still came over, no question asked. And I made coffee and sat at my kitchen table and walked through all of it again. The birds, the corridor, the reporter, the silence from every official channel. He listened with his hands wrapped around his mug, and when I finished, he said, "You know what the mail taught me?" I said I didn't. He said, that there's a category of information nobody wants to be the one to receive. So it sits in the system, getting passed along. Everyone's hands stay clean because everyone passes it on. You're not the problem, Dara. You just don't have a uniform that makes people feel like they have to stop passing. I didn't know what to do with that, except feel it. That night, I made a list of everyone I knew personally who might know someone who might know someone in either public health or agricultural oversight. It was a short list. I worked through it methodically, texting and emailing, trying to not sound alarmist, trying to sound alarmed enough that someone would pay attention. My cousin's husband worked for the state agriculture department in a capacity I'd never fully understood. I texted him a careful summary and asked if he knew the right person to contact. He responded 2 hours later with a name and a direct email address. I emailed that address at 11:52 p.m. I went to sleep. At 3:17 a.m., my phone buzzed with a forum notification. Someone had quoted my detailed post and added, "LMAU, the birdwatchers are predicting the apocalypse." There were 43 upvotes on that comment. There were 6 laughing face reactions. I put my phone face down on the nightstand. I lay in the dark, and I thought about the hawthorn stand, about 80 birds facing northwest in absolute stillness. And I thought about the word signal, about the fact that a signal doesn't stop being a signal because no one reads it. And I thought about what Mireille Fontaine had said. The signal exists, but we're just not receiving it. What happens then, I had told her. The event occurs. October 14th began with an email. Not from the state agriculture contact, not from county health, not from Derek at the university extension office, who had by now had his 2 business days and remained silent. The email was from a man named Paul Stritch, who identified himself as a retired USDA field inspector with 31 years of experience in livestock facility oversight in the Midwest and Mid-Atlantic region. He had seen my forum post through the social media amplification. He had read all of it, including the Dutch paper, which he said was not outdated but was in fact one of 3 papers from that decade that remained the foundational literature on diffuse threat flock response in social passerines. He said, "What you're describing is consistent with a biological stressor event of sufficient magnitude to trigger a coordinated avoidance response across multiple species at once. In my experience, the stressors that produce this kind of pan-species behavioral disruption are not subtle. I would contact your county health department directly by phone, not email. I would also contact USDA APHIS, Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, and use the words potential foreign animal disease concern in your first sentence. Those words trigger a mandatory response protocol." He included the APHIS phone number. I read that email 4 times. Then I made myself eat breakfast before calling anyone, because I had learned in the last 2 days that I made worse decisions when I was running on anxiety and nothing else. I called APHIS at 8:02 a.m. I used Paul's exact words in my first sentence. The person on the line, professional, unhurried, asked me a series of structured questions. Facility name, location, nature of the concern, basis of the concern. When I explained the bird behavior, the tone didn't shift dramatically, but there was a pause. A real pause, not a courtesy pause. She said they would flag the Marchetti facility for a monitoring review and that I would receive a confirmation case number by end of day. I received a confirmation case number at 4:17 p.m. I felt, for the first time in 3 days, like I had reached a floor, like something had caught. I texted Paul Stritch and told him. He responded, "Good. Keep documenting everything. If this is what I think it might be, your observation record is going to matter." I didn't ask him what he thought it might be. I think part of me didn't want the specificity. I had been operating in the register of something is wrong, and remaining there felt more manageable than the next level of precision. That afternoon, Cass Pruitt called. She had made her calls. The county health office had told her there were no active environmental alerts in the corridor. The Marchetti facility's communications person had said operations were normal. She had found nothing. She said, "I'm sorry, I really did look." I told her about the APHIS case number. She said, "Okay, that's something. If anything develops, I'll want to talk to you again." I thanked her. Then I went to the forum to update my post with the APHIS development. And I found it. My original anomalous arrival post. Not the longer detailed one, the first one, from 3 days ago, had been quoted in a thread on a large general interest social platform. The thread title was something like, "Bird Watcher thinks birds are predicting the end of the world, LMAO." My post had been screenshotted, cropped to remove the careful scientific language and the forum context, and presented as a punchline. The thread had 417 comments. Most of them were variations on the same joke. Some of them were about me specifically. My username, my writing style, the word stasis behavior, treated as evidence of pretension. 43 upvotes on the top comment. I still remember that number. I sat with that for a while. Not crying, not angry. Both of those would have required more energy than I had. Just sitting with the specific texture of being publicly mocked for being right. Because here is what was also true on October 14th, which I did not know yet. 4 individuals in Harrick County had sought medical attention for a symptom cluster that would, within 48 hours, be classified as the first confirmed cases. The Marchetti facility had reported 2 employee absences due to illness that morning. The grain elevator 3 miles south had stopped operations at noon for reasons that would not be disclosed publicly for another 4 days. All of that was happening while 43 people upvoted a joke about me. I did not know any of it. I just knew that I had a case number, and that the birds were gone, and that the empty Hawthorne stand kept appearing in my mind like something I had failed to read correctly, even though I had read it exactly right. Clifton came to my door at 6 p.m. with a covered dish, a sweet potato and lentil thing he made when he sensed someone needed feeding rather than advice. We ate at my kitchen table, and he asked how things stood, and I showed him the APHIS case number and the forum thread, and he looked at both for a long time. He said, "You know what I notice?" I said, "What?" He said, "In the laughing thread, none of the people laughing have gone to check. They just looked at what you said and decided you were the kind of person who should be laughed at. That's a different thing from being wrong." I said I knew. I said knowing it didn't make the laughing land differently. He said, "No, but being right is still better than being popular, especially right now." That phrase, especially right now, landed in a way he probably didn't intend, or maybe did. Clifton had 31 years of observing people through front doors, collecting the mail of lives in progress, and there was very little he said that was accidental. I told him I'd been thinking about my students, about what was going to happen to my class on Monday if whatever was building in the corridor arrived before Monday. I hadn't been thinking about it consciously, but I had been thinking about it. The way you think about things you're not ready to name directly. He said, "You should call the school." I said, "And tell them what?" He said, "Tell them you have reason to believe there may be a health situation developing in the county and that they should review their emergency protocols. You don't have to tell them everything. You just have to give them enough to start looking." I said I wasn't sure I had standing to make that call. He looked at me for a moment and said, "Dara, standing is a permission slip people wait for. You don't have time for permission slips." I called the school's emergency planning coordinator, who was a vice principal named Howard Turfel, after Clifton went home. Howard was efficient and slightly skeptical, and asked me 3 times to clarify what exactly I was reporting. I said I had filed an APHIS concern regarding a potential animal health issue in the agricultural corridor, and believed the school should confirm its emergency response protocols were current. I gave him the APHIS case number. He said he'd make a note. He sounded like a man making a note he did not expect to need. I sat at my kitchen table after the call and looked at my field notebook, the one Renata had given me for the important things. And I wrote down everything I had done in the last 3 days. Every call, every email, every forum post, every person I'd spoken to and what they'd said, every case number, every name. I don't know exactly why I did it. Documentation instinct, maybe. The science teacher reflex to create a record. The part of me that had already accepted, somewhere below conscious thought, that this record was going to exist in a world where the thing I was worried about had happened, and that it was going to matter to have proof of the timeline. I finished writing and closed the notebook and put it in my jacket pocket, left side, where it lived. Outside my window, the street was ordinary. Porch lights on. A neighbor's dog barking twice and then quiet. The specific texture of a weeknight in a small city where nothing was happening yet. I went to bed at 10 o'clock, which I never do. I slept, which surprised me. At 6:23 in the morning, my phone rang, and I knew before I answered it that the floor I'd found the day before had shifted. It was Greta, calling from the Netherlands at what must have been noon her time. She had seen something on a regional news aggregator, a brief item about 2 hospitals in Harrick County activating overflow protocols due to an unusual volume of emergency presentations. The item cited an agricultural area in the county as a possible point of origin. It was 2 paragraphs. It had been posted 40 minutes earlier. I pulled it up on my phone while she was still talking. The article used the phrase "preliminary investigation underway," and residents in the surrounding area are encouraged to monitor for symptoms. It did not name the Marchetti facility. It did not name the corridor specifically. It was the kind of article that is written when officials know something is wrong but are still in the window, where saying so clearly would require them to have answers they don't yet have. I got dressed. I called Clifton. I told him what I'd found, and I said, "I think you should not be going outside today unless you have to. I think you should make sure you have food and water in the house. I know that sounds extreme." He said, "You've been 3 days ahead of everything else. I'm going to trust 3 days ahead." I got in my car. I don't know exactly what I thought I was going to do. I drove toward the school. It was a Monday. Classes started in 2 hours. And the drive told me things the article hadn't. There was less traffic than there should have been at 7 a.m. Not no traffic, just less. A specific kind of less. where the absence isn't uniformly distributed, but is concentrated in the patterns of people who had already heard something and made a decision. I called Howard Turfel from the car. He answered on the second ring, which he never did. He said, "Miss Osei, I was actually about to call you." He said the district had received guidance from the county health office at 6:45 a.m., recommending postponement of in-person learning for the next 48 hours as a precautionary measure. He said it in the careful, procedural language of a man who was not yet authorized to say what he actually knew. I asked him if the school building would be unlocked. He said it was still staffed with administrative personnel through morning. I said I wanted to come get some materials from my classroom. He said fine. The school was quiet in the way of a building that knows it's about to be vacated but hasn't processed it yet. 2 office staff at the front desk. A custodian I recognized, named Ben, mopping the main hallway with his earbuds in. I waved at him. He waved back. In my classroom, I took my gradebook, my personal laptop, the hard drive with 3 years of curriculum materials, a first aid kit from the supply cabinet, and 2 boxes of the latex gloves I kept for lab work. I took the laminated evacuation procedure card off the wall. I took my spare car keys from the desk drawer, which I kept there for reasons I could no longer remember. Standing in that classroom, I felt something I hadn't felt yet in 3 days of fear and urgency. I felt the specific grief of a place you love, becoming something you're leaving. My students' ecosystem diagrams were still on the back wall. Mireille Fontaine's was in the center, labeled in her precise handwriting. The keystone species circled in red marker. I took a photograph of it. Then I left and drove home and did not look in the rearview mirror at the school because I understood, on a level I wasn't ready to articulate, that looking back was a decision I couldn't afford. By 10 o'clock, the news had escalated. Not dramatically, not the way it eventually would, not the way it looks in hindsight, where you watch the footage and can see exactly where the seam was. At 10 o'clock, it was still in the register of concerning but contained. 3 confirmed hospitalizations, cluster origin under investigation, residents encouraged to follow updates from county health. The kind of language that is designed to prevent panic and that, in doing so, prevents people from making decisions they need to make before panic becomes the only available operating mode. Marcus called. He said, "Dara, just my name. Just the way you say someone's name when you've been wrong, and you know it, and you need them to hear that you know it before anything else." I said, "I know." He said, "What do I do?" He was in Bridgeport, a 40-minute drive, and he was asking me what to do. And the clarity that came with that question was not the triumphant kind. It was the kind that arrives after you've passed the point where being right helps anything. I said, "Go to a grocery store right now. Not a big one, a small one. Get whatever's on the shelves. Go home. Fill every container you have with water. Do not leave your apartment again today." He said, "Are you okay?" I said I was okay. I said Clifton was across the street and I had supplies for 4 or 5 days, and I had been paying attention for 3 days, and that gave me time I wouldn't have otherwise. He said, "I should have listened to you." I said, "Go to the grocery store, Marcus." Not unkindly, just with the directional urgency of someone who had been trying to get people moving for 3 days and had learned that tenderness was slower than precision. He went. I spent the next 2 hours moving through my house with a systematic focus that I think was partly practical and partly the only way I knew how to exist in a body that wanted to panic but had decided not to. I inventoried everything: water, food, medications, first aid supplies. I pulled the weather radio from the hall closet. I brought Renata's notebook to the kitchen table and continued the record. At noon, Cass Pruitt called. She said, "I'm running the story. I want to quote you. The APHIS case number, your observation record, the timeline. People need to know there was warning and what happened to it." I said, "How long do you have to run it?" She paused. She said, "I don't know. I'm running it now." I said she could use my name. The story went up at 1:17 p.m. It was straightforward and well-sourced and 3 days too late in every way that mattered. And I read it in my kitchen with my coffee going cold and felt nothing in particular except a bone-deep fatigue that had been waiting for permission to arrive. Outside, it was just starting to get strange. Not here yet, not on my street. But the traffic patterns had changed again. The specific geometry of movement that happens when a significant percentage of a population decides simultaneously that being somewhere else is the priority. I texted Clifton, "How are you?" He texted back, "Sitting tight. Got a good book. Come over if you need company." I texted back, "Not yet." Soon I put my phone face up on the table and watched it, and it did not ring with anything from County Health or APHIS or anyone in official capacity who had received my warnings and was now calling to say so. It did not ring with any of that. The first infected individual I saw with my own eyes appeared on my street at 4:48 p.m. I want to be careful here, because this is the part that in retrospect seems like it should have been the signal, the obvious alarm. The moment where everything becomes undeniable. But it wasn't like that. It was a man I half recognized from the far end of the block. I knew he drove a silver sedan and had 2 dogs. I didn't know his name. And he was walking down the center of the road, not the sidewalk, the road. His gait was wrong in a way that read, at first pass, as drunk or ill in an ordinary way. He was not moving fast. I was watching from my front window. He stopped in front of the house 2 doors down and stood there for a long moment facing it. And then he made a sound I felt rather than heard through the glass. And then he moved again. I called Clifton. I said, "Lock your door, lock your windows. Do not open them for anything you're not certain of." He said, "Okay, just that." I locked my door. I checked all my windows. I went to the kitchen and I sat on the floor with my back against the cabinet under the sink. I don't know why the floor. Some instinct about being below sight lines. And I opened Renata's notebook and I wrote the timestamp. 4:51 p.m., October 15th. The man from the end of the block was still out there. I could hear him, periodically, in the way you hear something when you're sitting very still and the house is quiet, and the sound is wrong enough that your body tracks it, even when you don't want it to. I thought about the waxwings. I thought about 80 birds facing northwest in absolute stillness, registering something that had no name yet, before it arrived, before it had resolved into a locatable source. I thought about what that felt like from the inside of the flock, whether it felt like knowing or only like the compulsion to stop. I think it was just the compulsion to stop. I sat on my kitchen floor, and I was very still, and I did not move for a long time. The next 3 days are not what I'm telling this story about. But I have to walk through them because the ending doesn't make sense without them. The official designation, the classification of the outbreak as a declared public health emergency, came on October 17th. By then, the Marchetti facility had been identified as the origin site in all but official language, and the APHIS case number I had filed on October 14th had been incorporated into the incident documentation. I know this because Paul Stritch emailed me again. And this time he was not retired inspector being helpful. He was retired inspector being blunt. He said, "Your documentation is being referenced in the federal response file. Your timeline was accurate. For what it's worth, What you observed was a genuine early indicator of a biological event that the monitoring infrastructure wasn't designed to catch. You caught it because you pay attention differently than the systems do. I read that email in Clifton's living room. We had come together by the second day. Not formally, not a decision so much as an accumulation of proximity. His place one night and mine the next, cooking on a camp stove when the power flickered, playing cards because it was something to do with hands that wanted to be useful. Clifton was, it turned out, an extraordinarily steady person in a crisis. He'd grown up in a household where scarcity was ordinary and preparation was character. And he moved through the days with a patience that was not passivity, but was something more durable. The practiced calm of someone who had learned that panic consumed resources you couldn't replace. On the evening of October 17th, Cass Pruitt's article was being cited on national news. Not her. The article. Her name didn't make it into the bigger coverage, which is its own story about how information moves and who gets credit for its movement. But the facts in her piece were traveling. The APHIS case number, the timeline, the 3 days. A journalist from a wire service called me. I sat at Clifton's kitchen table with a notepad, and I answered every question carefully and accurately and without dramatization. Yes, I had filed the concern. Yes, 3 days prior to the first confirmed case. Yes, I had contacted County Health, the state monitoring line, the University Extension Office, a local reporter. No, I did not receive a substantive response from any official channel until APHIS confirmed my case number on October 14th, which was 1 day before the first news reports. The journalist was professional. She asked whether I believed the outbreak could have been contained if the warning had been acted on. I said, "I'm a middle school science teacher who watches birds. I can't answer that." She said, "Would you like to say anything else?" I said, "I'd like people to think about what it means that the warning system that worked was a person with binoculars and an 11-year observation record. And that the warning systems designed to work, the official channels, the institutional monitoring infrastructure, received the same information and did not act on it within the available window." She quoted that. I was right about that too. The community that Clifton and I were part of in those first weeks was not dramatic. I want to say that clearly because the narratives that emerge from events like this tend toward the cinematic, toward organized groups with clear hierarchies and decisive moments. What we actually had was a loose cluster of households on a residential street who happened to know each other well enough to knock on doors, share information, and not shoot each other over canned goods. There was a retired nurse named Yvette 2 houses down who became the de facto medical resource, not because anyone appointed her, but because she was the person people went to with medical questions, and she answered them clearly and said I don't know when she didn't know, which is rarer and more valuable than it sounds. There was a young couple, Dev and Priya, across the alley, who had a garden that suddenly became strategic and who shared it without negotiating terms, which established a tone for the whole informal network that I think prevented the kind of internal friction that destroyed similar groups elsewhere. There was Ben, the custodian from my school, who showed up on foot 3 days in with a handcart full of supplies he'd pulled from the school's emergency storage. He said the building had been evacuated and the supplies were going to spoil. He distributed them by knocking on doors. He did this without being asked, without expecting anything, and without commentary. These are the people I want you to remember, not me, not my forum posts or my APHIS case number or the wire service quote. Yvette knowing which symptoms required intervention and which required patience. Dev and Priya's tomatoes still on the vine. Ben's handcart. But I was the one who had been watching. And what I watched in those weeks was a group of ordinary people constructing something functional out of proximity and necessity. And I kept records of it the way I kept records of everything, because documentation was the only instrument I fully trusted. Renata's notebook filled up. I found a legal pad in Clifton's junk drawer and kept going. The forum, the North Central Migration Forum, went dark on October 19th when the hosting service lost power. I don't know what happened to Greta in the Netherlands. I sent 2 emails before connectivity became unreliable and received no response. I hope she was 3 days ahead somewhere too. Paul Stritch sent one final email on October 18th. He said he was relocating to his daughter's property in rural Virginia, that he had what he needed, and that he wanted to say one last thing before communications became undependable. He said, "You did everything right. I want you to hold on to that when everything around you suggests the only measure of right is outcome. You made the observation, you documented it, you reported it through every available channel. You escalated when the channels failed. The outcome is not a measure of your effort or your accuracy. It's a measure of how the system was built. Those are 2 different things. I have read that email more times than I can count. It does not fix what it is trying to fix, but it is true, which is not the same as useful, and is also not nothing." On October 20th, the wire service story ran with my full name and the detail about my 11-year observation record. Within 4 hours, I had 847 notifications on a social media account I barely used. Most of them were supportive. Several were from people who had commented in the thread that mocked my original forum post, now recanting, now apologizing, now saying they should have listened. I read exactly none of those, not out of bitterness. I want to be precise about that, not bitterness. It was more that the apologies existed in a timeline where reading them required caring about the same opinion in 2 different directions, and I no longer had the bandwidth for that. The people who had dismissed the warning when the warning could have mattered were, by October 20th, managing their own survival. That was the appropriate use of their attention. Mine, too. I closed the notification screen and went to help Yvette restock the first aid supplies we were keeping in her garage. That felt more like the right thing to do with a morning. October 26th, 11 days in, the man from the end of the block, the one I'd watched from my window, was gone. I don't know where he went. I'd learned later that his name was Gerald Pham, and that he had 2 dogs named for jazz musicians, and that he had retired the previous spring from 30 years of teaching high school history. I learned this from a handwritten note his daughter left on the mailbox a week later, asking if anyone had seen him. I saw the note. I couldn't answer it in any useful way. I added his name to the legal pad. There were 6 names on the legal pad, not from our immediate cluster we had held, through a combination of early preparation, Yvette's medical knowledge, and the particular luck that is always present in survival and usually goes unacknowledged. 6 names from the wider neighborhood. 6 people who had been here before October 11th and were not here anymore. I sat with that number for a long time. Here is the question I have sat with every day since. If the warning had moved differently, if the county health office had returned my first email, if Derek at the University Extension office had called back within hours instead of eventually not at all, if the Audubon Society had a direct line to APHS, if Cass Pruitt had been a journalist at a paper with 100,000 readers instead of 8,000, would the number on the legal pad be different? I don't know the answer to that. I know enough about outbreak epidemiology now, from reading, from Yvette, from the increasingly detailed federal reports that circulated in fragments, to know that early intervention in that first window was possible in theory. Whether the intervention that my warning could have triggered would have been sufficient, whether it would have reached far enough and fast enough, I genuinely cannot calculate. What I can calculate is the timeline. 3 days. I had 3 days. And what I did with those 3 days was everything I knew how to do. And it reached a retired USDA inspector, a 26-year-old reporter in a county seat, a vice principal who made a note, an APHIS case number that became part of a federal record, and 43 upvotes on a joke. I wrote all that down. I close the notebook and go back inside. It's been several months now. The Hawthorne stand is still there. I walked past it last week for the first time since October. And it was bare the way hawthorns are in early winter. The berries long gone, the branches skeletal and still. A flock of dark-eyed juncos moved through while I was standing there. Classic winter behavior. On schedule. Feeding, moving, making contact calls. Doing everything a healthy flock in ordinary circumstances does. I watched them for a while, and my field notebook was in my left pocket, and I did not take it out. I didn't need to write it down. They were fine. Mireille Fontaine is fine, as far as I know. Her family left the area early. The first week. I have no way to contact her. But I think about what she said in that lesson. The question that was too smart for the context I thought I was teaching in. What happens when the signal exists, but no one is built to receive it? I didn't have a good answer then. I have a more specific one now. What happens is that someone with a weatherproof notebook and 11 years of patience receives it anyway, and then discovers that receiving it and transmitting it are entirely different skills, requiring entirely different infrastructure, and that the absence of that infrastructure is not personal, is not targeted, is not correctable in the moment by working harder or being louder or being more credentialed. It is just a gap that the birds could see from the air, and that we were apparently still in the process of building the instruments to measure. I am still building mine. The juncos moved on. I walked home. Clifton was on his porch, and he lifted his coffee mug in greeting, and I lifted my hand, and that was enough. 2 people who had made it through on a morning that was cold and ordinary and intact. I went inside. I opened the notebook. I wrote the date,